All right, welcome to part 9 of the series on the 2007 Mackyard incident and Transport Canada's complete and total negligence, causing deaths, in my humble opinion, in the rail industry. I think that you're going to find this one to be rather eye-popping. Okay, as we've done previously, this is a copy of a paragraph on page 20 of the Transportation Safety Board investigation report tied to the Mackyard incident that happened in September of 2007. And this is my third video just on this one paragraph because it takes a lot of time and a lot of research to get all the pieces, get figure out the lies, put them together, and then present them. It took me literally, in some cases, years to figure out some of the stuff that I'm providing in these videos, but for sure months for this one. But, and the only reason I figured this one out is because I happened to find these materials, these training materials, in my child's bedroom when my child left our house. And I had to prepare an office for my husband during COVID. I happened to find these discarded training materials that my child had left in their bedroom. And so if I had not found these materials, I couldn't have put these critical pieces together in order to share them with you. So let's focus on what's written in green. And even though they call it the QSOC, as we saw in previous regulation, that is, or in previous videos, that is not the name of the regulation. The regulation is actually called the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, or SOR 87-150. SOR stands for Statutory Orders and Regulations. 87 was the year it came out, and 150 was the number assigned to that specific law. So let us look at what they have to say here. That regulation has been in effect since March 16th, 1987. Keep that date in mind. Although the regulation has not been updated since it was implemented, keep that in mind, it contains provisions to ensure that the training and certification of locomotive crews are being maintained at a significantly high level. I'm sorry, folks, but I just have to say it. In my opinion, they just flat out lie to your face in these reports. And you're going to see why I am of that opinion as we move forward. Now, if you look at this particular manual, this blue one, it has the name CN at the top, or the logo for CN, and it's called the Transportation QSOC, wrong name, Technical Study Material. And then it's got the categories for the study materials, and at the bottom, there's a date of 2010. You know, these materials were used to train my child in 2013. And we're going to see, labor codes require that you have the most up-to-date information in your training materials in order to train people in safety critical tasks. And being a frontline rail worker, I would say that qualifies for safety critical tasks. There's very few second chances in the rail industry. If you do something wrong, the chances of injury or death can be pretty high. So 2010, that's what they tell us, that was the date of these materials. I have my doubts, but we'll move on. And you'll see why I have my doubts. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, but I need to put it all together like this in order to be able to explain the issues. So bear with me. The top left manual, that's a training manual. It says CN up there. The student conductor or conductor trainee guide, that one is dated 2008. July 17th, 2008. And you'll notice that it has it's basically the Canadian Rail operating rules. Then on the middle section here, you have that document, the blue one, which again shows CN, and they seem to refer to this as the qualification standards for operating crews. And that is their technical study material guide. That one is dated 2010. Keep those dates in mind. On the far right above my head is Schedule 14 of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And that is the very last page. This regulation is only about 6 or 7 pages long, and this particular page is basically the last page in that regulation, and it shows all the categories, the occupational categories, so locomotive engineer, transfer hostler, conductor, or a yard foreman. Again, it doesn't show remote control locomotive operator, does not show rail traffic control, and it certainly does not show the track maintenance folks, which those are critical, safety critical operations or occupational categories in the rail industry. So why were they never included in this regulation? But this regulation, again, remember, dates back to March 16th, 1987, and it has never been updated since March 16th, 1987. Now, if you look at the categories here for what they study, okay, and for locomotive engineer, there's a block here that's pink. For a locomotive operator, they need to learn stuff having to do with motive power and distributed power, and so that applies only for the locomotive operator operations, or the locomotive engineer. Now, the guide obviously is used for both locomotive engineers and conductor trainees, and you're usually a conductor trainee first, and then you are trained after a couple of years as a conductor. You then go on to locomotive engineer training, as was done with my child. I think my child spent 3 years as a qualified conductor before going to locomotive engineer training. But anyway, the point is, when you go from conductor, a qualified conductor, to a locomotive engineer, you do not restart your training from scratch. You only study the new categories in the materials that you need to study. You don't go back and restart everything from scratch. And I think it's 6 of the 9 categories overlap for conductor trainees and locomotive engineer trainees. And so if you've been FATE qualified as a conductor trainee, you've also by definition been FATE qualified as a locomotive engineer. And that, folks, can help explain why the rail industry just gets exponentially more and more and more dangerous. We're going to keep going here. If you look at the QSOC technical study material in the middle here, you'll notice that all those categories, I drew the arrows, they match completely with the information that is in Schedule 14 of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And so to me, this begs a very serious question. Are your training materials, do they actually date back to 1987, given this regulation has never been updated? And these are the categories in a regulation. So if they had been updated, you should have the most recent information in this middle study guide. But if it's never been updated, why would you change your study guide? Based on what? What would you be changing it on? What would be the difference? And the fact that the categories match exactly word for word as far as the name, would also make me kind of think that this middle guide probably dates back to 1987. Just my opinion, but that would be before CN Rail became a publicly traded company. This guide may date back to 1987, and the training materials themselves may date back to 1987. That's 38 years ago, folks. And, you know, at that time, that would put all of this on Transport Canada if they've never updated these critical operational categories as far as the subjects that need to be studied for each operational category, each operator, whatever. You also don't see belt pack in here. They've never had a regulation for belt pack. In 2019, the Transport Canada came up with its first guidelines for belt pack training, and I ripped that apart. That'll be another series of videos. It wasn't pretty. I'm sure that then Minister Marc Garneau was not pleased with my analysis of his new guidelines for belt pack operations, but we'll cover that in another series of videos. Because it was pretty ugly. But anyways, the fact that all of these categories match basically 100%, except for the first one, seriously makes me wonder if this middle manual doesn't date back to 1987 instead of 2010. That would mean we're training frontline rail workers on material that is 38 years old. In spite of all the changes to rules, to regulations, to whatever in the rail industry, in spite of technical changes as far as signals, as far as, hot boxes, whatever. There are serious issues here, and if I'm correct in my assumption, again, labor codes require that people be trained based on current information. And you know what? You can't argue that something that is 38 years old is current. Not good enough, Transport Canada. The fact that that is your last version of this regulation does not excuse, in my opinion, your total criminal negligence. Because a lot of people have died in the rail industry. In my opinion, that has a lot to do with the training with which they are provided. So, I just have serious concerns about what we are looking at here. And the first block here on Schedule 14, where it says Regulation number 0-8, Uniform Code of Operating Rules, that's the one that they attempted to replace in the first attempt to overhaul this key regulation, SOR 87-150, after the Mackyard incident of September 2007, which is the subject of all these videos in the Mackyard series. And so it would make sense that, geez, look at my other little training guide here on the left, the white one. That one has the revision, the Canadian Rail Operating Rules version for 2008. I believe that those Canadian Rail Operating Rules first came out in 1990. That date is critical too, and I'll tell you why. Look at the last block here on the bottom left. That is a section of SOR 87-150, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, and this particular block is pertaining to sections 4 and 5, and it states, a railway company shall provide employee training necessary for the purposes of these regulations. Then it states, no railway company shall permit any employee to work as a locomotive engineer, transfer hostler, conductor, or yard foreman unless the employee has qualified for that occupational category in accordance with Section 14. That's what's above my head. That is Section 14. So, to be a qualified conductor, you must have received training and passed in all of these categories that are used under the conductor section. And if you're a locomotive engineer, you must be trained in all categories, but again, they don't restart from scratch. Same for a yard foreman, whatever. Then it says, in the case of a locomotive engineer or transfer hostler, has received a passing mark for on-job training in that occupational category. So, you must have your field tests, your field training, whatever. Now, here's where we get to the good stuff. This little point 2, and in one document I had received, that point 2 had actually been removed. Now, why would you do that? Why would you, why would it not be there? Or you put it as an orphan on another page. But look at what that says. Subsection 1 comes into force on July 1st, 1990. Okay, well, wait a minute. This regulation supposedly was written in and came and implemented and went into effect in 1987. But yet this only comes into force in 1990? Why would you have that in there? The thing that's odd here is, again, you cannot allow a person to be in an occupational category unless they have qualified for that category, meaning they received all the training in Schedule 14 and passed all their coursework, whatever. So, the 1990 to me is very interesting because what if, the regulation, if it hasn't been updated, so it hasn't been updated since 1987? Or were they waiting for this? Why the 1990? They didn't have the Canadian Rail operating rules until 1990. But even though they may have put into effect their Canadian Rail operating rules, as we saw in a previous video, those were implemented illegally because Regulation 0-8 under bullet point 1 in Schedule 14, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules was never repealed. And so if you have rules that are supposed to replace something in that regulation, the regulation must first be repealed. So wherever there's any contradiction between the Canadian Rail operating rules since 1990 and Regulation 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules overrides. And that would be very key when it comes to key definitions in regulations or in the rail industry. Definitions like transfer or how the word transfer is used as a piece of paper to transfer from one train to another versus how it is used today. A train going under, I think, 15 miles an hour in a yard or in occupancy controlled systems. Two very different definitions. And so, if it's used in a different way, the word transfer, the regulation would override. And the rule, the Canadian Rail Operating Rule of 1990 or later, would be null and void. So that's very, very key, this date of 1990, as far as what the implications of that are, especially when you consider the Canadian Rail operating rules And again, when they did the first overhaul of this key regulation after the Mackyard incident, they would put, and we're going to do a whole video on that a whole series on that public scam document that was a rules only document. So it's like they tried to take a regulation, and which is enforceable in court, and replace it with a rules document, which may not be enforceable in court, according to the Government of Canada Minister of Justice's own website. And for proof of that, if you need the proof of that, go to the videos on acts, regulations, rules, and to know the difference. When I did the intro to the Rail Families United, I also did a couple of videos on why it's so important to understand the difference between acts, regulations, and rules. And in those videos, I clearly pulled information from the Minister of Justice of Canada showing that acts and regulations are enforceable in court. So if Transport Canada has been violating those by not doing its job and properly approving all changes going on in the field, because it also wasn't doing compliance audits, it wasn't doing anything, and clearly if it didn't update anything in 38 years, well, I guess that's kind of proof of that too. But anyway, those videos on the difference between acts, regulations, rules, whatever, and why it's so critical to understand the difference, that's where you would see that information. And so if they were trying to take a key regulation and water it down after the Mackyard incident, never waste a good opportunity, even if it's a crisis that showed fake qualifications, and dangerous goods spills, and something that could have been a lot worse, because if the chlorine gas cars had actually been breached, you would have been having a chlorine gas leak just outside of Toronto, a major population center. But hey, we don't waste a good opportunity. And so when they tried to overhaul this regulation, and the Railway Association of Canada was a key player in that, along with Transport Canada, well, we tried to change a regulation, the entire Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150, which was, being enforced by the Canadian Transportation Agency, because the enabling act for that regulation was the Canada Transportation Act, which is enforced primarily by the Canadian Transportation Agency, which could have at its head a rail executive, as it did at the time of the Mackyard incident and at the time of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. So it certainly was not in their interest to expose all their wrongdoing by properly enforcing this regulation, but it certainly was in their interest to try and change what was a regulation and make it rules only, because the document they came up with was called Rules Respecting Minimum Qualification Standards for Railway Employees. So they tried to change this regulation 0-8 to a rule, the Canadian Rail Operating Rules. Then they tried to put the railway radio regulations and the dangerous goods training under the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, rules only. And by definition, by changing everything in that document to rules respecting minimum qualification standards for railway employees rather than a regulation, they were trying to make it so that you couldn't enforce that stuff in court. We're going to totally water down the laws. That was a complete and total public scam that taxpayers paid for. That whole effort started in 2007, and it was approved by Transport Canada in June of 2009. Paid for by taxpayers, a complete and total public scam passed off as a safety action taken by Transport Canada and the Transportation Safety Board. So these issues, folks, are so criminal in my opinion. I think a lot of people belong in jail over this. There are a lot of rail employees that have been injured or killed or they get brought in, they're used as cheap labor, then we just get rid of them, bring in a new crew, fake qualify them using potentially 38-year-old materials, and then, oh, you're not suited to this industry. We're going to get rid of you. Conductor trainee Jason Clooney had moved his family from Nova Scotia all the way across Canada to Saskatchewan, and he was killed there. He had uprooted his entire family, and this is what he was trained on. These materials, which may have dated back to 1987. Why would they be using a word like qualification standards for operating crews? Was that the wording used by the government of Canada prior to CN becoming a publicly traded company in 1995? I kind of think so. They're getting that wording somewhere. Where are they getting that? Because the regulation has nothing to do with that wording, as we have seen in, previous videos. And so I highly suspect, folks, that rail workers have been getting trained based on extremely outdated materials. And I have to tell you, when I went through this QSOC document here, what they call QSOC, there's a lot of references in that to old Canadian rail operating rules. They don't tell you how old, but if you remember, Tyrone Kowalski, who was the health and safety officer when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, in one of the pages he said, well, I don't know if they're using outdated test questions. I think he knew absolutely. He had spent 15 years as a conductor at CP Rail, and he had also been a health and safety officer for several years. But maybe the reason, and he worked for Transport Canada, so maybe the reason that he really didn't want to come out and just blurt it out and say that they were training based on extremely old and outdated materials was because it would expose the criminal negligence going on at Transport Canada, his own employer. Did you want to go there? Probably not. Probably a lot of pressure not to do that. Just my opinion, folks, but that would be how I would put this puzzle together. Why would you have this technical study material with the same categories if these categories and this regulation has never been updated? Per page 20 of the Mackyard incident, that one lying paragraph where they just outright lie to you, in my humble opinion, that one paragraph that's taken me 3 videos now to unravel for people. So that's my take on this. That's my opinion. You're free to form your own. As I consider all these issues pertaining to training materials and rules and whatever, I really have to wonder, how old was Deadly Training Slide number 53? That also had CN on it. But did that date back to when CN was a crown corporation of the government of Canada? There was no date on that training slide. It could very well date back to 1987. We have no way of knowing. But that's a question we certainly need an answer to, given such a deadly training slide. And if it does indeed date back that far, that would mean thousands of rail workers have been trained using Deadly Training Slide number 53. And that would be nothing short of the maximum criminal negligence on the part of Transport Canada. There would be no excuse for that. So you have to wonder, could it date back to 1987 with no one catching the deadly errors in that training slide? Again, used potentially to train thousands of frontline rail workers. And that's a truly frightening thought. But it wasn't just, if you look at this little snippet here, this comes from the health and safety officer report that looked into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And on page 57 of his report, he stated, a survey into the understanding of this rule, which was Rule 104, shed light on the extent of misapplication, the main question being, what are the points checked for? The points on the rail line where the tracks join. After you flip a switch over, you have to make sure that the tracks are properly joined at the points and that it makes one continuous track. So he's asking here, he said informal questioning at the workplace by the health and safety officer resulted in answers limited to see if it is free of ice. This suggests a broad misapplication to be a distinct possibility. It's not a distinct possibility, it's a fact if your answers are limited to things like to see if it's free of ice. And that, folks, only further confirms for me that deadly training slide number 53 and these training materials that are used today to train frontline rail workers may indeed date back to 1987, prior to CN Rail even being a publicly traded company in 1995. So we can see that, in the Health and Safety Officer report, test questions, the Canadian Rail operating rules, training videos, field supervision or lack thereof were also incomplete, inaccurate in what they reinforce. Even if for the intended route was or was not part of the test question, the materials are deceptive, they're contradictory, they're dangerous, and they're deadly. And no case better illustrates that than the case of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And if you haven't looked at my series on deadly training materials, you need to go look at that. And again, that would have been under the operational excellence of now UP CEO Jim Vena. But if the materials indeed date back to 1987 or even 1990, that would mean that we are seeing the operational excellence of pretty well every rail executive that has now gone to infest the U.S. rail industry, and potentially not only from CN, but also from CP, because those executives would go from one company to another. And so the infestation, as far as the operational excellence, if I'm right in how old these training materials really are, is an absolutely devastating blow for the government of Canada. Oh, and by the way, I just took a 5-minute break here while I was doing this video, and lo and behold, Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of Transportation, has resigned to become a new person to help rebuild Ukraine. She's got Ukrainian roots. Well, apparently so do I, and mine, I would argue, are much higher than hers as far as society in the Ukrainian. I have a sister who spent about 40 years of her life putting documentation together to prove that my family's lineage are one of the lost royals of Ukraine. So, it's like I tell my sister, unfortunately, she spent her life on this, but in my opinion, we all come from Adam and Eve, and I keep telling her, we're no better than the garbage man, and I have more respect for the garbage man than I do a lot of royals, because there's been a lot of pain and suffering in the world because of royals. So even if I was a descendant of the lost royals of Ukraine, and I actually have documentation to prove that. But anyways, even if I was, I would reject that, and I'm perfectly happy being a normal person. And I'd rather be a garbage collector than be a person like the likes of Chrystia Freeland. In my opinion, that woman belongs in jail for all of these issues. And I wonder, I can't help but wonder, she's known that this was going to be the year of disclosure. And I'm sure she couldn't run away from the Ministry of Transportation fast enough. So it's really good, really convenient that she gets to potentially go to Ukraine. Um, I think we have extradition, don't we, with Ukraine? I'm not sure. But I think she should face the music in Canada for all of the financial fraud, in my opinion, and the total breach of public trust that has gone on under not only her and Trudeau, but, the current government that continues to hide these issues, but also the Harper government and potentially a whole lot of others before that, if I'm indeed right in how old these training materials may really be. And that's truly frightening when it comes to matters of operational excellence, not only for the Canadian rail industry, but for that of the U.S. also, given so many of the players are now at U.S. Class 1 rail carriers. So, this whole question here is, you check the points to see if it's free of ice. Well, that's one reason, but it's not the main reason. The main reason is for the intended route, to make sure that the tracks are aligned for where you think the train is going. And deadly training slide number 53 absolutely showed the exact opposite of what it should have been showing, not once, but twice on the same slide, for a slide entitled Switching at Turnouts. It was showing track configurations for a train going straight. And this whole qualification standards technical study manual, the diagrams in that are even worse than what is in the on deadly training slide number 53. There's only an A, B, and a C on deadly training slide number 53. Those aren't even there in the qualification standards for operating crews technical study material. What you see in there for how things are taught is even worse, in my opinion, than what is being, well, you can't get much worse than deadly training slide number 53. But as far as the other stuff for training materials, when I read that, it almost looked like something that had been written for an 8th or 9th grader. That's how bad it was. I mean, it is terrible, that document. But anyway, so big question. You check the points mainly for the intended route. And they were not teaching that clearly, as this little on-the-fly informal survey done by the health and safety officer clearly showed. Okay, so when you're looking at what's provided in the training manuals and stuff, where they're talking about the switching activities and whatever, and this particular guide was divided in chapters, and so on page 1021 under switches, general, the following was stated. After throwing any type of switch, always check switch points to ensure it is completely and properly lined. Doesn't say for the intended route. And then it says, in winter operations, you may have to remove snow from the switch points before operating. And then on page 1022, it provided more general information, but this time it focused solely on general tips to avoid injury when you're flipping a switch, because you can hurt yourself doing that if you don't do it right. On 1023, it provided information on Rule 105, not on Rule 104, which was supposedly the one violated when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. On page 1024, it talks about yard switches and states that there are two types generally found in yards, the hand-thrown switches and semi-automatic switches. On this page, it states that the points are to be examined to ensure contact with the rail. A most confusing diagram is provided where absolutely nothing is labeled. So not even the route is indicated on the diagram. So even like A, B, and C, which was shown in deadly training slide number 53, you don't even see the route shown in what is shown in these particular pages. So Again, there's absolutely nothing labeled there in a section pertaining to how to operate switches. On page 1025, it discusses semi-automatic switches. Here, Rule 104.4a, B, and C are provided, where we see the comment on ice or snow. It's not Rule 104, it's Rule 104.4, A, B, and C. And that's where you see the snow and ice comment. Page 1026 through 1034, which is the end of that section, discusses Rules 108, 112, 113, 114, 115, and 116, not Rule 104. So there is, in my opinion, virtually nothing to tell conductor trainees that points need to be checked for the intended route. And if these training materials are as old as I think they are, there have been a lot of people that have not been receiving proper training. They've been receiving, indeed, very deadly training, and this could absolutely be contributing to rail accidents and injuries and deaths. Also, if you look at the CN Transportation Qualification Standards for Operating Crews Technical Study Material Manual, that blue one that was provided in the middle there earlier, CN, or maybe Transport Canada, also, depending on who owned that document, also very much defined a qualified person on page 52 in a manner I believe many would consider contrary to the law based on SOR 87-150. If you look at how it's defined here, it states a qualified person, and in the rail industry, the term has qualified means you've gone through all your training, which is provided here in table 1, which was part of that Mackyard incident report on page 11. They had broken out all of the various levels of training that you needed to go through all the different weeks. But according to this QSOC study guide, this technical study guide, a qualified person was defined as a person who, because of their knowledge, training, or experience, is qualified to perform a duty safely and properly. For example, a certified car inspector is qualified to inspect and maintain car brake equipment. Train crews as qualified to inspect brake equipment. So, the word "or" there's a huge issue with that. And I'm not just an MA in finance, I also studied technical writing all the way to the graduate level. And so when you have the word "or" there, that's a big problem. That should be an "and," because I can be top heavy knowledge. I'm a really smart person. And I could go through all those manuals, basically memorize them, and memorize anything else you want to give me as far as Canadian rail operating rules, whatever. I can be the smartest person out there and have all the knowledge. But unless I have the field training and experience, am I qualified? Absolutely not. Not based on this table, but that statement would make it such that as long as I have that brain knowledge, I'm okay to do this work. That's what that statement states. Should you be telling that to conductor trainees or to any other rail employee? If you look here, that statement would mean you would have week 1, week 2, week 5, 6, 7 for training. That's it. Everything else would be scrapped. So you don't need any of that other stuff, according to this, because it's an "or," it's not an "and." So you can be just really brain heavy, know it all, think you know it all, but not have any of the training that you need, field training, in order to do the work. Having the knowledge in your brain is not enough. You need the field training in order to do these jobs. So the illegal redefinition of key terms, enhanced responsibilities under the law, is another huge topic I have addressed in other analyses, etc. So, for example, I did a bunch of files, called 3 of them actually, on robust enforcement, which I provided to Transport Canada and others. And robust, in my opinion, means really obviously broken. What was the word I had in there? It was really obviously broken and untrustworthy in supervision and training, because I had received a letter from Marc Garneau, who was the Minister of Transportation at the time, telling me that I could be assured that Transport Canada had robust enforcement. Oh yeah, there's that lying right to your face again, in my humble opinion. But why should we be surprised? So anyway, he did not like my response, especially when I analyzed his new guidelines for belt pack operations, which I really ripped apart. And I'll show you that in another video series. So I guess this would explain also why rail executives are just fine with fake qualifications of frontline rail workers and or having managers at the controls. And managers at the controls is going to be another video series that's going to be most eye-opening in what it reveals. And when I'm talking managers at the controls, I'm literally talking accountants, IT personnel, whatever, those types of people being at the controls in a locomotive. Because, hey, anybody can do this job, right? You just have to have a little bit of brains and you can get in that locomotive and run that train and operate it properly. That's basically what these guys think, folks. Hate to say it, but when you put managers at the controls and when you folks see what the required training was in an incident involving 3 managers at the controls in a locomotive, that is going to be flabbergasting for people to see. But again, that's the operational excellence, from the likes. In this case, what I'm going to be analyzing is going to be an incident that happened at CP Rail when Keith Creel was Chief Operations Officer. So, but managers at the controls, you see that at CN all the time too. And so if the training is any similar at CN, pretty flabbergasting. And for Transport Canada to allow that to happen, I think you're going to see in my review that would, in my opinion, be an absolutely huge violation of the law. We're going to get into those issues. Okay, on this page, I guess I should say former Minister of Transportation, Chrystia Freeland, because she resigned today from that role to go over to Ukraine and, head Canada's efforts to rebuild Ukraine, a most corrupt country. In my opinion, she'll do just quite fine dealing with those people, because I'm sure she's well aware of what corruption is, my humble opinion. But anyway, she had started this effort to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And I can't see who's going to be the poor person who's now going to be Minister of Transportation for the Government of Canada. What a hornet's nest that person's going to be jumping into. But I'll let them know. They'll be added to my distribution list as soon as I know who's going to be taking over. And I'll let them know why Chrystia Freeland jumped. I'm sure they're just going to appreciate that. But anyway, Chrystia Freeland, again, started the ball rolling in order to get the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation overhauled for a second attempt. And that whole thing was kicked off basically when she threw Trudeau under the bus. That weekend is when they published that they were going to be doing this and repeal the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. But I want you to notice here, so this particular first screen print is taken, again, from the Canada Gazette, which is Canada's official publication document where they, say what they're doing as far as new laws and whatever. So for it to be official, it has to be published in the Canada Gazette. But what I want you to notice here is when they're talking here in the first sentence, it says the regulatory regime for federally regulated railway workers has not been updated since the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And she refers to it as REQSR. Okay, well, note though that she's not using the words qualification standards for operating crews. She is using the correct name of the regulation. Now, why would that be? Because she knows that I know that qualification standards for operating crews is not a regulation, even though it appears as a supposed regulation in Transportation Safety Board reports, which were signed off on or which were reviewed by Transport Canada. So they should have corrected those errors, but they chose not to, because it's all part of the deception of the public. Keep the public confused. And that's to all of their advantage as rail carriers and as supposed oversight bodies, in my humble opinion. But anyways, note that she's using the proper wording there, not the bogus name for the regulation. And at the bottom here, I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that Michael Sabia, the new clerk of the Privy Council, reports directly to the Prime Minister of Canada. And as clerk of the Privy Council, people need to know that the Transportation Safety Board reports in directly to the King's Privy Council. And so Michael Sabia, very high up position there, but Michael Sabia, oh, well, why was he made clerk of the Privy Council? Do you think it might have something to do with the government trying to shield itself from massive liabilities? After all, Michael Sabia from, let's see, it says 1993 to 1999 worked for CN Rail in various roles, including Chief Financial Officer. There's that cost cutting, and where do you cut? Personnel, frontline training programs. Great place to save money, right? Fake qualified. And he was there in 1993 before CN became a publicly traded company in 1995. So I just can't help but wonder, when he went over to CN after it became a publicly traded company, did he file those changes to railway employee training programs as the law required under the Railway Safety Act, Section 20? Because the previous program, when CN was a Crown Corporation of the Government of Canada, it used to take 2 years to become a qualified conductor. And when CN became a publicly traded company, well, those public servants at Transport Canada, they're a little dumber, so we'll give them 2 years to become qualified. When CN became a publicly traded company in 1995, that training program went from 2 years to 5 months or less. And I would love to know the role that Michael Sabia played in that, especially now that he's, the clerk of the Privy Council. Was he put in that position to try to help the government of Canada shield itself from all these massive liabilities pertaining to all these scandals in the rail industry? Because now the gig is up. You guys have been caught. And who would know better what was going on at CN and what was done or not done than a person who was there in several roles, including Chief Financial Officer for CN Rail. So ask me if I trust Michael Sabia any further than I can throw him or throw Chrystia Freeland. Absolutely not. All right, well, I hope that you found this video to be most enlightening and eye-popping, because if we are training, and that's an if, we are training frontline rail workers with materials that might date back to 1987, that, in my opinion, is total and complete criminal negligence causing death in the rail industry on the part of Transport Canada and its rail partners in crime, because that would still not excuse CN Rail, a multi-billion-dollar international company, or CP, from, overhauling their own programs and submitting their changes to make sure that their employees are properly trained. If they're using old training materials that could date back so many years, like 38 years, again, there's no excuse for them either, in my humble opinion. So this is going to conclude part 9, and we're going to keep going with part 10 pertaining to the Mackyard incident and so many issues being revealed. So on that note, have a great day, and I will see you on the next one.